Hi, my name is Solon Brenner, and I will be discussing the pros and cons of the following resolution, which is resolved that the U.S. Department of Agriculture shall ban the use of antibiotics in animal feed for disease prevention in healthy animals or to promote growth. So the current status quo and where we're at with antibiotic use in farming is that it's very commonplace. It's very common practice. 70% of antibiotic use in the US is devoted to livestock. This is generally because it increases the growth of livestock, which gives us more bang for our buck. One chicken being larger is better than having two chickens that are about medium size. It also keeps livestock very healthy, as we'll discuss later on. Given our current farming practices, this is a preventative measure generally to kind of make sure that all the animals prevent getting infected from some sort of pathogen rather than to heal them after they get prevent or after they contract the pathogen. So the resolution is basically banning the use of antibiotics for these two purposes, which is again to increase the growth of our livestock and to keep our livestock healthy preventatively. Um, and this is because the use of the rate, or the main contributor, the use of this rate may be contributing to a crisis in antibiotic resistance, because the use of these antibiotics non-therapeutically creates a constant selective pressure on pathogens that may be there. So they tend to evolve to become resistant to any sort of antibiotics that are being used. So the first pro is on antibiotic resistance. So the overuse of antibiotics for either growth or preventative measure results in resistant strains. Again, the pressure that is being placed on these pathogens, the evolutionary pressure, is going to cause these basically mutant pathogens to become resistant to the antibiotics that are being used on them. And our only current way to combat this is to basically quit while we're ahead. We found an antibiotic that's working, so let's not use it so much so that it gives bacteria a chance to evolve past it. Um, and resistant strains are on the rise and effective antibiotics are declining. The National Antibiotic Resistant Monitoring System found 97.7% of chicken breasts sampled had E. coli, and many samples were resistant to one or more antibiotic. So basically, what this evidence is saying is that this national system sampled a bunch of chicken breasts and found that a lot of them were infected with E. coli, and of that E. coli, a lot of it was actually resistant to antibiotics. Another study took 472 bacterial isolates from non-farmed animals and found that 58% of those isolates were at least resistant to one antibiotic, and 43% of the isolates were resistant to more than one antibiotic. And this is alarming because these non-farmed animals are animals surrounding farming communities. So we have so basically this is evidence saying that antibiotics are leaving these farming and agricultural communities and spreading onto um, non-agricultural communities and non-farmed animals, causing them to form resistant bacteria. So our con is on antibiotic resistance. And the major issue is that there isn't a clear link between the um, the bacteria and the strains that are becoming resistant on agricultural lands and the bacteria that are causing, or the resistant bacteria that are found in human diseases. So there are two real main issues or ways this can happen. The first one is with this point A, which is that resistant bacteria is not adapted for this is human to human transmission. So basically, it's present in food animals and it somehow becomes present in humans, usually by ingesting the food that's infected. The issue is down here, we see that it's lacking concrete data. Transmission from food to human is just, it's not really seen. And models to try to find this have proven ineffective. The other way that it is going to travel from animals to humans is the transfer of resistant genes through horizontal gene transfer. Um, and again, this is very difficult because it's very hard to determine transmission. And we also have very little evidence that these food animals are being used as a reservoir for these genes. So we're just not really seeing how these genes are transferring from resistant bacteria in animals to being transmitted into bacteria in humans that force them to become resistant. So there's just no real conclusive evidence on, again, the transmission from animal to human. We suspect it, but again, there just hasn't been that evidence saying it. which questions whether or not this ban is actually necessary or helpful. No, the other pro is the animal rights. Um, so banning the use of subtherapeutic antibiotics may lead to better and more sustainable farming practices. The current use of subtherapeutic antibiotics is used to make factory farming safer, as discussed in the first slide, um, for animals. So basically, non-therapeutic farming or non-therapeutic antibiotics are used to prevent these chickens here, for example, from getting incredibly sick because they're literally stacked so close. You can see kind of over here, they're on top of each other. So because they're so close, they're very susceptible to getting very sick. So they're given a lot of antibiotics to kind of prevent that from happening in the first place. Um, and that's to just again keep the animals alive and keep costs high or keep costs low, keep profits high. So banning the use could also lessen the prevalence of antibiotic-resistant infections among these animals. We see that in Denmark, they banned non-therapeutic antibiotics, and they found that the infection rates of resistant pathogens, antibiotic-resistant pathogens, was actually very, very low among the animals once that ban was placed in effect. So we see the prevalence of these pretty rough infections going down once the ban was in effect. So another con is, again, animal rights. We see this other side. So the Coalition for Animal Health argues that banning the non-therapeutic antibiotics um, would devastate animal health, and that's because, again, the current practice of animal of factory farming is very bad for animal health if not given the preventative antibiotics. So they argue that it would hurt the efforts of veterinarians, efforts which are shown as, again, the non-therapeutic use. And it would make it very hard for animals to keep animals healthy and maintain safe food supplies. So if we ban these non-therapeutic uses, our current farming industry is going to have essentially this really, really big issue of all these animals that are going to get sick very quickly because they're not being given the supplemental antibiotics that prevent them from getting sick in the first place. Um, and the members of the Coalition for Animal Health includes the American Veterinary Medical Association, American Association of Swine Veterans or Veterinarians, and Animal Health Institute. Um, so these are people who are constantly monitoring these animals, and these are the people who kind of brought these practices to light and made them commonplace. And they're saying that again, this is really going to affect a lot of the animals. So we're going to have all these animals that get very sick very quickly while we are trying to change the way we farm, if we can try to change the way we farm. Now, one really good pro, I'm going to switch my screen over here, is the lack of economic consequence that we see. In theory, banning non-therapeutic antibiotic use or subtherapeutic antibiotic use has little impact on the meat market. So it doesn't affect necessarily the profits of meat farmers, and it doesn't really affect the price that consumers will have to pay. Many farms are actually losing interest in antibiotics currently as the success has decreased. So over here, this picture of the chickens generally can sometimes be used to kind of talk about not gene therapy, growth hormones being used or even antibiotics being used. But actually, this picture is more along the lines of selective breeding that we've been using and how we've using effective feeding models and selective breeding, we've actually made animals a lot larger. So one animal, again, will kind of create a larger meat production from just one animal, which is great for the farming community. So antibiotics don't really have too much to do with that. There is evidence that antibiotics do increase the size of animals when given to them. But overall, the actual increase in size is generally due to selective breeding and feeding. Um, and economic, so this is a quote from the National Research Council saying that there is an economic incentive to improve animal care. So basically what that's saying is that as farmers would transition to more sustainable farming practices, that's actually a economic incentive. They will be making more money. And this is because sometimes meats actually cost more when being raised with antibiotics. Um, but yeah. So a con is the disheartening results that we've been getting from places that have been banning subtherapy. So the European Union, especially Denmark was the first to ban, or at least the first European country to ban non-therapy use. So they banned it, and this is a massive basically continent-wide experiment that we can look at as an example. However, the results did not favor the ban for humans necessarily. So, as discussed earlier, once the ban in Denmark went into place, we saw that the infection rates in animals decreased quite a bit. However, the infection rates in humans did not decrease. There was actually really no correlation with the antibiotic resistant infections in animals and the antibiotic resistant infections in humans. So, this point kind of goes towards the lack of evidence for the connection between these two infections, the zoological infections and the human infections. But really, what this is saying is that even when we do take this, so to speak, risk, and we ban this and allow our animals to get very sick very quickly, um, we don't really see the human incentive for it. We don't really see our antibiotic resistant crisis decreasing at all. So it kind of questions whether or not the ban is necessary in general. So the last part I will talk about is my opinion on the matter. Personally, I am for the ban or upholding resolution, which is that we should ban basically non-therapy antibiotics for the use of preventative measures and for growth. I think that there may not be concrete evidence um, on the link between these infections in agricultural areas and the infections in human areas, but I do think that safer farming practices won't contribute to the problem, if that makes any sense. Um, I think that generally the scientific community does believe that there is a link, even though it has been elusive. But even if we do take that step and create safer farming practices, that won't make this any worse. There hasn't been any evidence to say that this has been any worse in Denmark. Um, and again, more sustainable practices will be better for animals, giving them more room to be free, giving them generally a better quality of life. And I think that's a step in the right direction morally for animal treatment. So I am in favor of the resolution. Thank you.